Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, November 13th, 2018. Look out, the dreaded Tuesday the 13th. Is that a thing? Do we worry about Tuesday the 13th? Why not? The power of 13, really. Why should it only fall on a Friday? I say any 13th is bad news, quite honestly. I don't know why I would actually believe that, but it seems like a fun way to start the show, so why don't we do it? November 13th, look out. Oh, hey, look, well, that'll ruin our intro music, won't it? Yeah, I wasn't thinking too much about that. Okay, well, look, we'll have to do without it, at least today. That'll throw things off for the beginning of the show, but don't make a great deal of difference. What did that musical bed really buy us besides a few minutes of relaxed intro anyway? And who needs to relax when there's so much going on that we could be covering? We might as well get straight to it, as though this were purposeful. Is there no way that I can play two sound effects at once? That's actually quite annoying. I hadn't thought about that because it was really clearly not worth it to play that sound effect. Anyway, okay, Daily Co's Radio is live now, and you can tell we're live. A properly produced show would not have screwed that up if we had been able to record ahead of time and simply start over. But hey, here we are. Daily Co's Radio is live now. Bill knows this is the case. We've spelled it out quite clearly for all of you who are listening live at this point. We're wondering, let's see, what am I wondering? Bill, tell me what I'm wondering. I need to know whether Kristen Sinema's stunning, and that's in quotes, stunning, Senate win in Arizona was just an elaborate Republican trap that's going to doom Democrats in 2020. No, wait, that's Chris Salitza's story. Okay, well, we'll have to read that story later. I believe that might even really be a true thing. That could actually be the story. Donald Trump is awake and anger tweeting, but no one's reading it, which is a fantastic development. Though I understand, I just saw The Hill adopting the protocol of not necessarily, anyway, retweeting the president's actual tweets, but using the screen captures. I like that one. He's out and attempting to defend himself on not going to either of the cemeteries, either in France or here, Arlington Cemetery, yesterday during the observation of Veterans Day, which we took a Monday off from. I forgot that all the government offices and banks, etc., were going to be closed yesterday. Actually, I've been meaning to get to the bank for some time to make a special trip, and got it all together to go yesterday, only to find, oh yes, it's closed. I wasn't thinking about that. And, maybe the cemetery was closed. Has anybody thought of that? I see he's tweeting, though, that he really wanted to get there. The helicopter couldn't fly because of almost zero visibility. I suggested driving, but the Secret Service said, no, too far from the airport and the big Paris shutdown. Speech the next day, pouring rain, et cetera, et cetera. So more excuses. It's a pretty poor excuse at that. Honestly, that's exactly the sort of excuse that he would never have bought if it had come from anybody else. But who cares? He's a jerk, and we can be done with him. All right, let's see. Next item of business for the day. Quick reminder for everyone that Matt Whitaker is not the acting Attorney General. At best, he merely purports to be the acting Attorney General. You should say so. Thank you very much. And I do notice that the state of Maryland apparently getting ready to sue on just that question. I saw NBC News covering it, but only after I had pocketed the story from the hated The Hill. But I guess we'll share the news anyway. Maryland expected to ask for an injunction saying Whitaker is not the legitimate acting Attorney General. Emily Birnbaum reporting this one for The Hill. The state of Maryland is expected to ask for an injunction on Tuesday saying Matt Whitaker is not the legitimate acting Attorney General, claiming instead that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein should have been promoted to the position, the New York Times reported. Suppose we should read their story on it instead, except, although maybe by reading the New York Times reporting, I will lure Armando onto the air. I probably should have arranged this ahead of time. But Armando, if you're listening, I see you are steaming, and I think quite correctly, about what's happening down in Florida with the vote counting and recounting. So we'll open up the door for a possible discussion with you about that, if you can keep it together and not, not fly off the handle. But we are, of course, on Tuesday without Greg here today, so we do have room for you in the schedule, if need be. Let's finish up about Maryland here, though. The injunction will come as part of the state's lawsuit against former Attorney General Jeff Sessions. According to the Times, who resigned at President Trump's request last week, a federal judge in Maryland will now have to name Sessions' successor in the lawsuit. That's interesting, too. And the state is planning to argue Whitaker's appointment to the role was not constitutional, according to a draft filing obtained by the newspaper. Trump may not bypass the constitutional and statutory requirements for appointing someone to that office, the plaintiffs reportedly wrote in the draft filing. Since Whitaker's appointment last Wednesday, Democrats have called on him to recuse himself from Robert Mueller's Russia probe, citing his public comments criticizing the special counsel. Whitaker once declared there was, quote, no collusion, unquote, where did he get that line, between Trump and Moscow, and said the special counsel's investigation was a waste of time that could be undercut by denying it funding. Maryland will reportedly ask Ellen Hollander of the Federal District Court for the District of Maryland to rule Whitaker's appointment unlawful, pointing to the president's use of the Vacancies Reform Act to fill the vacancy left by Sessions. The state will argue that Trump's invocation of the statute was atypical, as it is intended for routine positions and not the Department of Justice's highest post, the Times reported. Another statute specifically says the Deputy Attorney General should be appointed if the Attorney General leaves the position, the filing says. So then there's that. The position of Attorney General calls for the highest levels of integrity and personal judgment, but we had Jeff Sessions, but whatever. Prerequisites safeguarded by the Constitution's command that principal officers be subject to the oversight and check provided by Senate confirmation, the filing says, according to the Times, who we presume can actually read. Some Democrats have raised concerns that Whitaker's appointment is an attempt by Trump to undermine the Mueller investigation. Really? Which he has criticized as a witch hunt for more than a year. Democratic leaders on Sunday sent a letter, I tell you, requesting a formal update from the DOJ's ethics office on whether Whitaker should recuse himself from overseeing Mueller's investigation. No, he shouldn't. He just shouldn't be there, period. You shouldn't have to recuse yourself. You're just not allowed to rule on it in any way, shape, or form. You are not the Attorney General nor the acting Attorney General. That's the position I'm taking on this one. Does the New York Times have anything to add to that? Let's see. Whitaker's appointment as acting Attorney General faces court challenge. Probably not. Charlie Savage. Oh, you know what? Well, maybe it would be worth reviewing what Charlie has put together on this. In the days since President Trump ousted Attorney General Jeff Sessions and declared that he was installing, and that's a proper terminology, that just simply declared that he was installing Matthew G. Whitaker as the acting Attorney General. Many critics have challenged Mr. Whitaker's fitness for the job. That was obvious, too. Some have gone further, calling his very appointment illegal. Now the appointment is facing a court challenge. The state of Maryland expected to ask a federal judge on Tuesday, that's right now, today, for an injunction declaring that Mr. Whitaker is not the legitimate acting Attorney General as a matter of law, and that the position and all its powers instead rightfully belong to the Deputy Attorney General, Rod J. Rosenstein. Mr. Trump may not bypass the constitutional and statutory requirements for appointing someone to that office. We did hear that same thing from The Hill, which was just repeating what they read in the Times, I guess. The legal action escalates the uproar surrounding Mr. Trump's installation of Mr. Whitaker as the nation's top law enforcement officer, from criticism of his basic credentials and his views on the Russia investigation to challenges to the legality of his appointment. Yes, that's what the lawsuit means. Last week, Chuck Schumer of New York, the Senate's top Democrat, sent a letter demanding, I tell you, to know why Mr. Trump chose an unconfirmed political appointee as acting Attorney General rather than follow the Justice Department's statutory line of succession. Good question. Not terribly, doesn't really strike fear in your heart, but it's a good question. So again, the judge is Ellen Hollander of the Federal District Court for the District of Maryland, a 2010 Obama appointee, in case you were wondering. And she'll have to rule on who is the real acting Attorney General, as part of this lawsuit in which it sued Mr. Sessions in his official capacity. Because Mr. Sessions is no longer the Attorney General, the judge must substitute his successor as a defendant in the litigation, so she has to decide who that successor legally is. Ooh, that is interesting. The stakes are extraordinary. So it wasn't that they simply said, this is illegal, we're filing suit because of this. They were already, I guess, involved in a lawsuit against the Department of Justice, naming Sessions personally in his capacity as Attorney General, he having now stepped down, i.e. having been forced out and sent to the Saudi consulate, so to speak, a farm upstate. We now have to sue the at least acting head of the Department of Justice in person in Sessions' stead. Who is that person? You actually have to ask the court, who do you think we should put on the title page of this thing? That's an interesting way of approaching it. The stakes are extraordinary. The acting Attorney General is the most powerful law enforcement official in the United States and wields tremendous influence. Yes. From overseeing criminal and national security investigations to deciding how to enforce immigration, environmental, and civil rights laws. The head of the Justice Department also supervises Robert S. Mueller III. I don't know if you know who he is, but he is, we're helpfully told, in a subordinate clause here, the special counsel investigating whether Mr. Trump's associates conspired with Russia in its election interference and whether Mr. Trump tried to obstruct that inquiry. Shoo, I'm glad I know. A Trump loyalist, Mr. Whitaker has been an outspoken critic of the Russia investigation. We know all about that. Maryland filed the underlying litigation in response to a separate lawsuit by Texas and several other Republican-controlled states challenging the Affordable Care Act. How do you like that? They argue that the law's so-called individual mandate to obtain health insurance, which the Supreme Court upheld in 2012, became unconstitutional later on, after Congress last year reduced its tax penalty to nothing. Yes, an interesting approach to that case all by itself. So I guess Texas and other Republican states suing to invalidate basically challenging the underpinnings of the Affordable Care Act. The individual mandate is unconstitutional after they reduced the tax penalty to nothing. So it's no longer a tax. It's simply a mandate to buy insurance. I'm not sure how I sort that one out in my head. But we could sit with it for a while, but let's move on instead. In June, the Justice Department under Mr. Sessions agreed with Texas and said key parts of the law, surprise, including the provision that protects people with pre-existing conditions, must be struck down. In response, Maryland filed its own lawsuit in September. It asked Judge Hollander to declare that the contested parts of the insurance law are constitutional and to direct the government, and Mr. Sessions in particular, to enforce it as written. Now we need to know who else should we be directing to enforce it as written. The Attorney General of Maryland, Brian E. Frosch, working with the law firm of Goldstein and Russell. Good luck for you getting your name in the paper there, Goldstein and Russell, brought the litigation. Thomas C. Goldstein, a partner in the firm, said they plan to file the motion on Tuesday morning. Again, that would be now. Neither the judge in the Texas lawsuit nor Judge Hollander has ruled on the Affordable Care Act issues, but because the government's enforcement of the act is set to change on January 1st, Maryland said it needed an injunction now to prevent Mr. Whitaker from illegitimately controlling the Justice Department's policy and legal positions. Among other things, the lawsuit cited Mr. Whitaker's declaration in a 2014 Q&A that the 2012 Supreme Court ruling upholding the Affordable Care Act was one of the worst rulings in the court's history. In defending Mr. Whitaker's appointment as lawful, the Trump administration has pointed to the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, a 1998 statute. It says that a president may temporarily fill a vacancy for a position that normally requires Senate confirmation with any senior official who has been in the department for at least 90 days. As Mr. Sessions' former chief of staff, Mr. Whitaker meets that criteria. But Maryland's court filing argues that the law applies to routine positions, not to the Attorney General's office. For one thing, it noted another statute specifically says the Deputy Attorney General is next in line at the Justice Department. That's harder to get past. A more specific law, the lawsuit argues, and we hopefully will agree, takes precedence when in a conflict with a more general law, a canon of judicial construction, as it were. There were good reasons for lawmakers to create an exception that gives the president less flexibility when it comes to replacing the attorney general, the Maryland filing argues. Among them, without that check, a president under investigation, like, say, this one, could install a carefully selected senior employee who he was confident would terminate or otherwise severely limit the inquiry, like, say, Matthew G. Whitaker. Is his middle name G, middle initial? I forget. Okay. It's been a while and it doesn't matter. There were good reasons. We just read that one. The Maryland filing also cites a part of the Constitution. Oh, a wise idea. Known as the Appointments Clause, which requires principal officers, very powerful and senior officials like the Attorney General, to have been confirmed by the Senate. Yes, this is part of the Constitution we all remember. In a phone call last week, Mr. Whitaker told Senator Charles E. Grassley of Iowa, the Republican chairman of the Judiciary Committee, that a 2003 Office of Legal Counsel opinion held that the president could temporarily appoint him to be acting attorney general even though the Senate had not confirmed him, Mr. Grassley has said. Okay, so what? The 2003 opinion relied on an 1898 Supreme Court case about a man who was appointed the acting American consul in modern-day Thailand when the Senate-confirmed consul became sick and no Senate-confirmed deputy consul was available. Obviously directly on point. But the Maryland court filing argues that the circumstances of the 1898 case were too different from today's situation for it to apply. Among other things, it notes that the office of Attorney General did not become vacant through an unexpected emergency, and that several Senate-confirmed Justice Department officials like Mr. Rosenstein are available. The sweeping power of the Attorney General calls for the highest levels of integrity and personal judgment, even though we had sessions. Prerequisites safeguarded by the Constitution's command that principal officers be subject to the oversight and checks provided by Senate confirmation, the filing said. Now, I have no doubt that Republicans could force his confirmation since they hold the majority. It's simply a matter of you're going to have to go on. This is what the Constitution demands. You're going to have to go on record. People who are accountable to voters are going to have to go on record saying, yes, despite all the shortcomings, despite the conflicts of interest, despite the dictates of statute, we think this is the person for the job. And he ought to be considered, they really just basically have to confirm him, period, as Attorney General without the acting. If they want to, allow this to happen. It's just one of the requirements of the president's the president's prerogative to install officers of his choice is subject to that check, the Senate. Now, this Senate won't check him very much, but they should at least have to go through the motions. That's the basic argument here. Although the true basic argument of his propriety, I guess, as acting Attorney General, I think really comes from elsewhere. That would be, in this case, the statute that tells you what happens when there's a vacancy in the office of the Attorney General. It's laid out by law. The Deputy Attorney General steps into that position, and if he can't, then the next person in line will. And they have a whole set. They got the whole statute designating what those lines are. So, why don't you follow it? Well, it would be more convenient if we just chose somebody who would do exactly what I want instead of settling for the people we put in there before when we asked the Senate who should be what. It was an old Senate, and it had a bunch more Democrats in it. So we shouldn't be listening to that. That's the story. All right, let's see. Much more, of course, hanging out there to get a hold of. And let's see. We'll go over to Pocket, but I guess if Armando isn't available, I still will have to tell you what's happening down there in Florida. The question is, do I have a newspaper article to lean on in this one? And I don't. And so I should probably head out and look for one. But let's see. I understand that from Armando and Armando's complaints, essentially, on Twitter, that in the middle of Republicans' false and baseless accusations that election law is being broken by Democrats somehow in Florida, presumably in order to get us to the point where the recounts can proceed and Democrats are as close to as possible to making up the deficit in votes counted to date, that they're somehow cheating and creating new votes and allowing votes to be counted that either shouldn't be or weren't even ever cast properly in the first place, or maybe never even cast. They're even accusing Democrats of making up new ballots and pretending that they come from ghost voters. Although why we would pretend they come from ghost voters, I have no idea. No, rather pretending that they come from real voters, though they are in fact ghost voters. All sorts of accusations being leveled. And as usual, it's projection and the worst sort of, lie about the situation. In the meantime, as we said, because it's projection, we're finding out, according to, now here we are, some of the stories. I've got some Miami Herald, I've got Politico, I've got CNN, everybody reporting that Bay County in the Florida Panhandle, where they were hit by the hurricane very recently, and we were all wondering what sorts of accommodations might be made for people still recovering from the hurricane. I guess we'll go to the Miami Herald on this one, as close to local sources we can get. Some auto-playing video we'll have to deal with, but hopefully we won't get the audio from it. What ended up happening, surprisingly, let's say, here's the headline. Bay County allowed some hurricane victims to vote by fax or email. That's not allowed. That's right there in the headline, which is a good place to put it because it's ridiculous and belongs there. Under what circumstances would you be allowed to vote by mail or email, or rather by email only, or fax? None. And it's explicitly forbidden because, of course, everyone would tell you it's far too subject to, what's that thing that the Republicans are so worried about again? This is, of course, a very Republican area of Florida. And so it would behoove, let's say, that's a good word to use, the Republicans to count as many votes from this part of Florida as possible. And so, we do want everybody to be able to cast a ballot, but for whatever reason, the Florida legislature has said that it's just simply not going to be valid to cast your votes that way, and that's because supposedly they're worried about fraud, unless it means Republicans voting and Republicans winning as a result. So here's the deal here. Let's see. Elizabeth Coe and Nicholas Nehamas are the reporters for the, where are they? The Miami Herald for this one. Dateline to Tallahassee, of course, appropriately. As counties recount ballots in 3 statewide races and lawyers battle over the complex vote tallying in court, the top elections official in Bay County said he allowed some displaced voters to cast ballots by email or fax after Hurricane Michael hit the Panhandle, even though there is no provision for it in state law. And I had understood that it was worse than that. It had been prohibited by state law, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Bay County Supervisor of Elections Mark Anderson said Monday that 11 ballots, that's not a whole lot, were accepted by email, and 147 ballots were domestically faxed in. That's not a huge number, but that's a number, 147. Though state statute does not allow emailed ballots, and faxing in ballots is only permitted for military and voters overseas. But Anderson defended his decision to accept those ballots by email and fax vigorously. I didn't even know you could accept faxes vigorously, but he says he did. Noting that the mass devastation that rocked the coastal community 1 month ago, or noting the mass devastation. Not that, because we don't have anything else to say about that one. All right. That's interesting. I mean, it was bad, no doubt about it. You did not go through what we went through, he said. That is true. We did not. You did, but that actually doesn't matter. Describing areas that were shut off by law enforcement and people barred from returning to their homes. If some are unhappy we did so well up here, I don't know what to tell them. We sure had an opportunity to not do well. I can tell you that much. I don't even know what that's referring to. Anderson said that all of the ballots were verified by signature. We'll see about that. And voters were required to sign an oath. Oh, my. If I can invalidate it with a signature, the ballot is there. Or if I can validate it with a signature, the ballot is there. How is that different than a ballot that comes through in the post office? And the answer is it didn't come through the post office. If that's what the law says is required, well then, why didn't that happen? When devastation happens, leaders rise to the top and make decisions, he added. I will not change my mind on this. Not for these voters. So he's a leader by sitting in the office and collecting these things by fax. Okay, whatever. Anderson had said earlier Monday that about 150 ballots had been accepted by email, and he also told local television station WJHG/WECP, take your pick, I guess, on that one, which first reported the ballots returned by email Friday, that 147 displaced voters had sent ballots to his office that way. I'm curious, by the way, how displaced voters out of their homes because they've been destroyed are emailing and faxing ballots. Are they headed to Kinko's? Did all of those get spared from the destruction of the hurricane? Are they driving to another county and doing it there? I have a feeling that, a month plus after the hurricane, if you needed to cast a ballot, you could probably find a location where you could just go and vote. But all right, fine, fax and email, sure. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We were continuing with our, we were reading from the Miami Herald the story of how Bay County has decided, for whatever reason, to allow people to vote by fax and email because of the recent devastation wrought by the hurricane. Was that Hurricane Michael? I can't even remember the names. They'll never forget, I'm sure. The name of the hurricane that did this. I'm just a little curious about how difficult it is to set up a polling place and to get people to go there and vote. I mean, presumably the vast majority of Bay County cast their ballots the traditional way. If only 147 needed to email or fax their ballots in, and if you're homeless, essentially. Why you should look forward to the opportunity to spend your day in a warm, dry place. Well, I guess for Florida, maybe a cool, dry place, like a polling station. But I guess if you had already asked for an absentee ballot and were going to file it anyway, and then found out that following the devastation of this hurricane, I had to cancel my trip, but I'm also homeless, well, then who knows? Or maybe you evacuated and your home was destroyed and you're living with relatives in another state, far away even, and you have your absentee ballot as a result, and you wanted to send it in, but you forgot or something, or all the mailboxes in Bay County were blown away in the hurricane and flew out to sea, and there was no way for me to mail my ballot in time, so I will email or fax it. I don't know. mixed feelings, I guess, about this one. I mean, that's not the way you're supposed to be able to put your ballots in. I mean, voting is a pain in the butt for a lot of people. And I'm sad that the hurricane came, etc., and made things difficult. And that's a real thing, and it creates difficulty, and you shouldn't get either everybody needs to be able to file their votes this way or nobody. I mean, that's just the bottom line of it. 147 votes, not likely to change the outcome anywhere, but again, we're always saying every vote counts. It also should count that every vote be cast legally, especially if you are going to spend the rest of your day complaining about all the quote-unquote illegal votes that were actually cast by people dragging their butts to polling places and trying to cast a ballot, only to be told by Florida officials that they're not registered anymore because last time they had an opportunity to vote, they didn't do it, and so therefore you're purged, and here's a provisional ballot, and you got to jump through hoops, but everybody else gets to fax them in. I find that annoying, to say the very least. And I think Armando feels, well, generally the same way, but a lot hotter about it, and he's right. It's the way these ballots should basically be invalidated. Unless the legislature, I mean, in this case, they're just going to have to be invalidated. You really needed to find another way to get your ballot in. And I'm sorry that you didn't, but you didn't. I don't really find any way to construct a way of forgiving it. But here's this guy's version of why he would forgive it. Is fax an email? Or is that an electronic transmission devices? These are interesting questions. Well, electronic transmission, that's email, he said. I knew some of them had been returned via fax, but I've had arguments with some people that electronic communication is all email, so I figured I'd throw them all together. Well, maybe that's not a good figuring. And I guess when they say that the ballots were returned by email, I suppose if you're talking about scanning your ballot and attaching it as a PDF or whatever, or whatever, it doesn't really matter what file format you use, I suppose. But attaching that to an email is largely, then you're talking about pretty much the same thing as a fax, honestly. Or, there's really no reason to distinguish between the two of them. It's just that, look, either you turn in a ballot or you don't. And they didn't. They turned in a picture of a ballot, and, in some states, they'll arrest you for taking a picture of your ballot. You're not supposed to, it's not supposed to be electronic, period. I guess, on the other hand, you could say, what's the difference between an electronic voting machine and one of these? And I guess the answer is you have to show up and be verifiably a living, breathing person, and, of course, show your ID and all that stuff. And around the rest of the parts of the state, they're invalidating people's ballots because the signatures don't match. And it's particularly galling when your signatures don't match because one of the signatures that they ask you to provide for a comparison is done on, well, an electronic device. If you have to sign one of those touch pads with your finger, your signature is not going to match the one you write by hand with a pen. That's not a real comparison. All right. After recounts were declared for 3 statewide races over the weekend, we finally have recounts, including U.S. Senate, Governor, and Commissioner of Agriculture, how votes are being counted across the state has come under extreme scrutiny. The second round of unofficial returns are due Thursday at 3 p.m. Nobody would even be visiting anyone. What? Nobody would even be visiting anyone if this race wasn't close. Anderson said, it's the nature of the beast. Visiting? Okay. Governor Rick Scott issued an executive order filed 18th of October. That would be October 18th here in the United States. That's the way they wrote it. I don't know why I reversed it. That allowed election supervisors in 8 hurricane-hit counties, Bay, Calhoun, Franklin, Gadsden, Gulf, Jackson, Liberty, and Washington. Those are the counties hit by the hurricane that the governor said in his executive order of October 18th could extend early voting days and designate more early voting locations, among other measures, meant to lessen the storm's impact on voting. But it did not allow for votes to be returned by email or fax. In other words, the governor already went out of his way to make it possible for all those folks to cast their ballots. and 147 or so of them decided, not going to take advantage of any of those, but I will fax or email a ballot in. And I guess that's a lot better than, for instance, the idea of voting by email. It first struck me like, really? You're just allowed to like write in and say, dear election supervisor, wanted to vote, couldn't, hurricane a month ago, 2 months ago, whatever it is at this point. Couldn't make it to an early voting station, couldn't make it to a regular voting station, but I do have an internet connection. And will you please mark Skaterboy29573 down for a vote for all the Republicans who are running. I'm going to vote the straight Republican ticket. And so are Patriot 92460, John 81639, and hey, John 81640 as well. We all vote Republican. Thank you very much. Signed, the totally real people here living in this house, and maybe 60 or 70 others that we could make up email addresses for. I mean, I hope they're not doing that. Just count that as a vote, please. Let's see. Continuing on, though, with the reality of the article. The votes, the executive order didn't allow for email or faxed votes. Voting by fax or email is not an option under the executive order. The Florida Department of State stated in a news release that accompanied Scott's order. So you were warned on October 18th, this is not going to work. Don't do this. 150 people said, I'll do it anyway. And the elections officials said, why don't we just count them? In the hardest hit areas, communication via phone, fax, and email remains challenging and would be an unreliable method for returning ballots. Additionally, past attempts by other states to allow voters impacted by natural disasters to fax or email ballots have been rife with issues. And if we know anything about Republicans, it's that they hate voting that is rife with issues. But that's because they hate voting. But Anderson contended that when the order was written, no one knew the amount of damage that would still linger weeks after the storm. The people who can't make it to a polling station should have starved to death by now. They're really, at this point, a month later, you can drop off your ballot someplace. You can put it in the mailbox. It'll be fine. That's why the decision was made to move in that direction. He said, you need to put yourself in the hurricane category and condition where we have food, water, and basic shelter, because that's still all we have basically in Bay County. Poor Bay County. All right. He said he had informed the Department of State about halfway through mega voting. What? That he intended to accept some ballots submitted by email. I don't know what mega voting is. Is that a thing? Is that a typo? In a statement, Department spokeswoman Sarah Revel said, declined to comment specifically on Anderson's claim that he informed the state that he would be taking ballots by email. State probably should have said, no, you won't be. The Florida Department of State has received reports that the Bay County Supervisor of Elections allowed some voters to return their ballots via email and fax, she wrote. Supervisors of elections are independently elected constitutional officers, and it is each supervisor's responsibility to adhere to the laws at all times. We did what we could. I'm sure I'm not the only county, Anderson said, though he declined to name any others. I know there were a lot of displaced voters. Franklin County Supervisor of Elections Heather Riley said her office only accepted faxed or mailed ballots, 12 in all, from military personnel and overseas citizens, which I guess is already contemplated as permissible. Carol Rudd, Supervisor of Elections for Republican-leaning Washington County, said her office also did not receive emailed ballots from those displaced by the hurricane. Also did not, yeah, all right. Displaced voters had the option to request ballots be mailed to temporary addresses where they may have taken refuge from the storm. For instance, several first responders from other parts of the Panhandle who were aiding recovery efforts in Washington County had their absentee ballots mailed to her election headquarters in Chipley, she said. Even if elections officials there had gotten emailed ballots, Rudd said, they would not have accepted them. We are going according to the order. She added, allowing email voting may not have made a significant difference to turnout in Washington County, which hit nearly 58%. We had a lot of people who were displaced going without power, so I don't think a lot of them would have had access to email, Rudd said. Our turnout was impressive given what the Panhandle has been through. Turnout in the affected counties was lower than the statewide average, a Miami Herald analysis shows. Roughly 57% of registered voters in the 8 counties cast ballots, compared to 62.5% around Florida. That's pretty good. But the county's 2018 turnout actually exceeded turnout in 2014, when it stood at 54%. You've got to do what's best for your voters in the conditions that exist, Anderson said Monday. There's no statute that says you shall not email ballots. I did what was appropriate. Well, there's no statute that says you can. I know that's the case. And the order apparently was accompanied by a statement that says these will not be acceptable. Well, okay. I care less who wins. I don't care, added Anderson. I care about the people that were able to vote, have their votes. I thought that's what everyone else did too. There are about 225,000 voters in the affected counties out of a statewide total of more than 13 million registered voters. Generally speaking, I am for counting every vote that you can. It's just either everyone has to have the option to be able to do that, or no one should. And if there was a statement accompanying the order that said this form of voting isn't valid, you can't then turn around and say, but it will be if you're voting Republican. That's not exactly what he's saying, of course, and I suppose there could be some Democratic votes in there among them, but I find it odd that there are Republicans literally outside the Broward County offices screaming that there's cheating going on when they have nothing to say about Bay County. That is at least a little bit annoying. We'll say that much. Okay. Let's see some comments coming in here that we will include. Left-leaning cock, good to hear from you again, saying, notice which Panhandle County was not granted extended ballot consideration. I did not notice. Leon County, home of Mayor Andrew Gillum, even though Leon County qualifies for federal disaster assistance. That is a good point, and I didn't know it. There's no chance that I would have noticed which Panhandle County was not granted extended ballot consideration, because I have not looked at a map of the Panhandle divided up by county, probably ever. And, well, gee whiz, I probably should have, but luckily we have people like you who are actually familiar with the Florida Panhandle to point great things like that out. That's true. That's a good point, and it makes me feel a lot less sympathetic, I guess, towards what happens in Bay County. Let's see, another comment here. Does this have to do with this? Yes, Michael Musson commenting, the biggest issue is the double standard for voting rights. One for white GOP areas and one for non-white Dem areas. If I was standing in line all day to vote, I would appreciate an email option too. Yes, all right, that's as much a disaster area as anything else, I suppose, especially if you have to stand in line for hours and hours. There's only one machine. It keeps breaking down. Some people stand in line like 7 hours. That's a natural disaster in my view. Fax it in. Go ahead. Email it from your phone while you're online. Like not online. Oh, not one word online. Standing online. Or as the rest of the country might say, in line. Or in the queue if you're outside of this country. Who knows what they may say in the Panhandle colloquially. Okay. Well, that's an issue. It's not huge because it doesn't involve a great deal of votes, but like I said, if we're going to be arguing to everybody that because races are so close, every vote counts, you got to cast your ballot, et cetera, then 150 votes is a big deal. It's 150 times more than I get to cast. So there you go. All right, let's see other things that we should check in on. Let's turn over to the Washington Post, which is still a newspaper that I'm allowed to subscribe to, apparently. Trump is preparing to remove Kirstjen Nielsen as Homeland Security Secretary, aides say. And I can only imagine that Trump has in mind appointing somebody from the Showtime series Homeland. He's going to take somebody from Central Casting now. I didn't think Trump fired blonde ladies, but I guess he's tired of this one. Nick Miroff, Josh Dawsey, and Philip Rucker writing for the Washington Post. Story, I mean, what else do you want to know? He's going to fire Kirstjen Nielsen. Do you want to know why? Okay, fine. President Trump has told advisors he has decided to remove Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, and her departure from the administration is likely to occur in the coming weeks, if not sooner, according to 5 current and former White House officials. What's being said here, of course, is Trump is going to ask someone to do the job of firing her because he doesn't do his own firings, because the truth is he's not the guy from the TV show, and he's a chicken, and he's afraid of the confrontation. And just like all the rest of the firings, he's going to have somebody else do it. Trump canceled a planned trip with Nielsen this week to visit U.S. troops, because it might rain, I guess, at the border in South Texas, and told aides over the weekend that he wants her out as soon as possible, these officials said. Sounds like Trump. The president has grumbled for months about what he views as Nielsen's lackluster performance on immigration enforcement. All she's been doing is putting babies in cages. That's not enough. And is believed to be looking for a replacement who will implement his policy ideas with more alacrity. The announcement could come as soon as this week, 3 of the officials said. Trump has changed his mind on key personnel decisions before, and Chief of Staff John Kelly is fighting Nielsen's pending dismissal and attempting to postpone it, aides say. But Kelly's future in the administration himself, I guess, is also shaky, according to 3 White House officials. And she was a protege of his, wasn't he? Or do I remember it incorrectly? Was it another official? Wasn't? I mean, I thought that was the relationship that they had, right? DHS officials who work with Nielsen declined to address her potential departure Monday. The secretary is honored to lead the men and women of DHS and is committed to implementing the president's security-focused agenda to protect Americans from all threats and will continue to do so. Spokesman Tyler Q. Holton said in a statement. Nielsen has been reluctant to leave the administration before reaching the 1-year mark as secretary. That would come on December 6th. But she has been unhappy in the job for several months, according to colleagues. Trump has berated her during cabinet meetings, belittled her to other White House staff, and tagged her months ago as a Bushie, a reference to her previous service under President George W. Bush and meant to cast suspicion on her loyalty. When Nielsen has tried to explain the laws and regulations that prevent the government from drastically curtailing immigration or closing the border with Mexico, as Trump has suggested, the president has grown impatient and frustrated, aides said. It does not work that way, or well, it should. Nielsen's departure would leave a leadership void, of course, at the government's 3rd largest agency, which has 240,000 employees and a $60 billion budget. The deputy secretary job at DHS, you would normally, like we learned in the attorney general issue, when the vacancy occurs, the next highest ranking person steps into the job, except there's nobody in the deputy secretary job at DHS. It's been vacant since April. I don't remember who used to be in it. I wonder what happened to them. I don't know. And the White House has not submitted to Congress a nomination for that post because of all the obstructionisms. Unless Trump were to name another official to lead DHS in an acting capacity, the day-to-day task of running the agency would fall to Claire M. Grady, the Undersecretary for Management at the DHS. That's because we have rules about what to do when there's a vacancy, and Trump ignored those rules to install Matthew Whitaker. Trump has told White House officials that he has begun contemplating replacements for Nielsen. He could name one of the agency's other Senate-confirmed principals, such as Kevin McLeenan. I'm going to guess is the pronunciation of M-C-A-L-E-E-N-A-N. McAleenan. I'm going to say it's probably something closer to actually McLennan. McLennan. You never know. Well, who is he? Why would he become the director or the acting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security? Because he is the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Or it could be David P. Pekoske, maybe, P-E-K-O-S-K-E, Administrator of the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, and a former Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard. Those guys might be sufficient to the job. If I were advising the White House, I'd encourage them to nominate someone with executive branch experience. That's a great idea, said one senior DHS official who spoke on a condition of anonymity to share candid views about his agency's leadership. This will be our fourth secretary in 2 years. The last thing we want is someone who needs hand-holding. And interesting, you even have to get like anonymity to say, I would, if it were up to me, if I were advising the White House, I'd say they should give it to somebody with experience. You better not tell them your name because they'll come looking for you if you're recommending that they choose someone who knows what they're doing. Well, that, of course, would get in the way of nominating someone like, the next paragraph says, Chris Kobach. Chris Kobach's loss in the Kansas governor's race has generated speculation that Trump could attempt to nominate him as a replacement for Nielsen. But Kobach, Kansas's Secretary of State, currently, still, remains a polarizing figure whose hardline views, especially on immigration, are considered by many observers to be too extreme to win Senate confirmation. Why don't you just stay acting? Colleagues who've worked closely with Nielsen and defend her performance at DHS say working for Trump on immigration issues is miserable because the president has an unrealistic view of border security and little patience for the intricacies of U.S. immigration law. It's a problem. Nielsen was selected for the DHS job by Kelly, and her imminent departure is another indication that his influence over personnel decisions has waned. Kelly has defended her repeatedly, and aides have grown annoyed by their close relationship. He often praises her impromptu in senior staff meetings while not praising other cabinet members who feel sad about that, I guess. Former colleagues who worked with Nielsen were astonished when Kelly pushed to install her at DHS because she had never led a large organization, let alone one with so many responsibilities. Nielsen worked on disaster management response with the Bush White House, then in the private sector and academia as a cybersecurity expert, before returning to DHS to work as chief of staff under Kelly when he was Homeland Security Secretary during Trump's first 6 months in office. That's kind of a funny thing there, too. Once again, going to the chief of staff for a replacement. But there, at least, it wasn't a matter of naming her as an interim acting. She was being nominated, and they were asking the Senate for confirmation. Still, it is odd that they both go to their chief of staff. But it was immigration enforcement that became one of Trump's biggest frustrations, and the president has blamed her for a rebound this year in the number of people arrested along the Mexican border. What's the blame? They were arrested. I thought that's what you wanted. At the peak of controversy over Trump administration's zero tolerance family separation initiative, Nielsen nonetheless stood at the White House lectern and delivered a vigorous defense of the measures. The president loved her performance, especially when she said there was no administration policy on separations, which was a lie, of course. But he loved it because it was a lie. Days later, under withering criticism, the president changed his mind and ordered an end to the separations because of how resolute he is. You see how this thing works. Okay. Whew. Other stories deserving of mention. Let's see. There's a couple of them. And we're going to have to grab a bunch. Oh, let's see. This one isn't what I thought, but we'll see if we can check in on that one. If I take a look, I got as I recall, an email through the Daily Kos system that perhaps had some suggestions about what we might want to take a look at for the show. And now I'm having trouble finding which one it is here. Let's see. Was it in this? I thought I had marked these things, but I guess not. Well, that's interesting. I wonder what happened to that. I feel like, where did that come from? I'll have to see if we can dig that one up now. Now, if I can't track it down inside here, is it in my... No, I can't. That's too bad. I thought I had that one set aside, and now I can't. I mean, I set it aside because I couldn't remember. I knew I wouldn't remember what the subject was, but we'll see if we can find that one during the break. Okay, let's see. Other interesting items that we might want to contemplate. This one perhaps we'll save for tomorrow when speaking with Joan. Here's more Florida information just to update you on the various things that might be happening down there and who's involved in what. We have Pam Bondi from a couple days ago inserting herself into the vote counting situation. Of course, we had the situation where the governor insisted that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to begin an investigation into the counting of the votes, and they eventually did report back. Yeah, we look at what was going on, and we found there were no violations of the law that required our attention. And now Pam Bondi jumps in to say, I'm troubled by your finding that there was no illegality. Go find some illegality. I guess she's still auditioning for some work in the Trump administration. And I am saddened to report that we did, in fact, finally hear some rumors of her being considered for work in the administration, either at, at some level at the Justice Department, if Whitaker doesn't work out, or even if he does, or perhaps maybe over at Homeland Security as well. But her name is being bandied about because bandy kind of semi-rhymes with Bondi, I guess. And, of course, she's a favorite of his because he is able to bribe her into dropping cases against him, and that's a very valuable asset from his point of view. Okay, we'll catch up on a couple other things. We'll catch up on some Trump-Russia developments in the second hour and check in on, a few other odd stories that have been lying around for a couple of days. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Let's see, there's a couple other items as I'm scrolling through Pocket here that we could bring up. We haven't made mention of this one, also a big part of the Florida story. The complaints first via Twitter and then later written up as an opinion piece in USA Today by Patrick Murphy. Former Florida Congressman Patrick Murphy. I'm a former Florida Congressman. This one begins, it's not me, of course. It's Patrick Murphy speaking. I am a former Florida Congressman, and my vote was rejected over a signature, quote, mismatch. And we find out what the hell's going on here with the signature stuff. Voter suppression, the subheader says, can happen to anyone, even a former U.S. House member like me. Yeah, I don't know how much like me he actually is, but okay. It's against our ideals to sideline people who want their voices heard, and that's true. All you have to do is mail the damn ballot. Apparently you're supposed to be able to just do that. I think that if you mail a proper ballot, I don't know. For whatever reason, we've decided that that's an acceptable form of transmitting ballots, and faxes and emails aren't. So for the time being, they're simply not going to be acceptable. But here's one that was actually mailed and still didn't get counted, and let's look at why. The hallmark of every true democracy, he begins, is fair, free, and accurate elections. It's what separates us from the dictatorships and totalitarian regimes of other countries, or counties, as the case may be. The American people have faith that when they head to the polls to cast a ballot, that vote will be properly accepted and counted. The state of Florida is no stranger to close elections. We are still ridiculed in political circles for the debacle following the 2000 presidential election, in which, maybe you heard about this one, Al Gore, George Bush, battled over hanging chads and butterfly ballots all the way to the Supreme Court. In my very own election to Congress in 2012, it took ballot retabulations and weeks of legal wrangling before I was declared the victor by just over 2,000 votes, a slim 0.6% margin. And now, Florida voters are faced with recounts for 3 statewide races that are each separated by less than 0.5%. Governor, senator, and closest of all, agriculture commissioner, in which the margin between the candidates is in the hundredths of a percent. If it wasn't obvious already, it should be crystal clear that every vote counts, except mine didn't. My absentee ballot was declared invalid over my signature. After it became clear that several races were too close to call on Tuesday, I decided to check my absentee ballot status on the Palm Beach County Elections website, only to find that my ballot had been rejected because of an invalid signature mismatch. That's in quotes. I've been a registered voter for over 15 years and an active Palm Beach County voter for 6, and yet that wasn't enough to get my ballot added to the official tally. Voters who get notice in time can sign and return an affidavit that has to be received by 5 p.m. the day before the election. But my vote wasn't actually logged until Election Day. According to the Palm Beach Elections website, there is no remedy to my situation after the fact, so unless that's changed by the county canvassing board or a legal challenge filed by Senator Bill Nelson, the judgment call made by an unelected county employee may reject my vote, and that decision will stand. I wonder how many others across the state had this mismatch scenario affected without their knowledge. Would the single parent working 2 jobs or the snowbird heading out of town to see family for the holidays see this notice in time to make the correction? For races being decided in the hundreds of votes out of more than 8 million cast, the decision to summarily reject a validly cast ballot is unfathomable. We must work to reform this system now. Just this week, we made great strides in expanding the right to vote in other important ways. Nearly 65% of Floridians chose to extend the franchise to ex-felons who have paid their debt to society. It is refreshing that after President Donald Trump tried to suppress the vote with nonsensical voter fraud commission, the Florida voters from across the political spectrum chose to veer in the opposite direction and encourage more people to participate in the political process. We ought to treat, the next section is titled, treat voting as the most sacred right of all. But in other ways, our system, not just in Florida, but across the nation, continues to actively discourage voting. Polling places are shuttered at college campuses purely for political reasons. Early vote centers are underfunded and understaffed to the point where lines are hours long, snaking around city blocks. And voters are often purged from the rolls for missing an election or for having minor errors in the spellings of their name or address. This is completely antithetical to the democratic ideals that we as a nation have fought for. I think this is all true. I don't even think you need to be reminded of it, but there's only one more paragraph to go. We'll do the courtesy of reading his entire piece. My vote on November 6th may not end up being counted, but we have too much at stake at this time in our nation's history. From the threat of climate change to the disappearing middle class to the scourge of gun violence to unfairly push people to the sidelines who want their voices heard. It is imperative that we treat the right to vote as the most sacred right of all. That may even mean accepting ballots by fax and email. I may make an exception if we can just get it passed for everybody so that everyone has the same access to the same ease of voting. Then I may be willing to accept it at that point. That's fine, but just not before. All right. Let's see. Other stories to share here. Here's a minor one that I missed from Trump's disastrous trip abroad, but I thought I would throw it in there because I've got it, and it's short, and it's somewhat funny. Mark Lowen is the source here. Mark is the BBC's Turkey correspondent, the country, not the meal. Previous, or the live bird, if you prefer. Let's take a look here, and I'm not even certain what we're looking at here. Oh, a clip of a French newspaper, Le Monde, as a matter of fact, the French newspaper. And it is, of course, as you might expect for a French newspaper, written in French. So I'm going to have to rely on Mark Lowen's understanding of the translation here for verification of this story. This was from, the 10th. So that was, let's see, yesterday was the 12th. So Saturday's paper, or Saturday's tweet anyway. Le Monde reporting, when Trump received the leaders of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, he began by blaming them for anything, really. I mean, what's the point? Do we even need to read any further than that? And I guess, what did he meet them in a NATO context, or just all of the war memorial events going on? I guess one of the few things that he actually attended here, but I guess he's at some point presented to the leaders of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and he immediately is going to pin the blame for something on them because he's Trump. But because he's Trump, he blames them for the war in Yugoslavia. That may have caused some consternation. They were probably staring it around. I wonder how quickly they figured out what was going on. Well, I'm certain that they knew fairly quickly that they were not to blame for the war in Yugoslavia, but I wonder whether they knew what was happening within minutes, or did someone have to explain to them? I mean, I'm not really sure. So obviously they would have said to themselves, we are hundreds of miles, 1,000, 1,500 miles from Yugoslavia, here in Estonia anyway. I guess we're somewhat closer in Lithuania, which is to the south, but even so, we're talking about 1,000 miles away from Yugoslavia, perhaps. And it dawns on them at some point. They figure it out. He's confused us here up by the Baltic Sea, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, with the Balkan states, the Balkan region, you see. That's where Yugoslavia is. Oh, and they both begin with B. Actually, they both begin with BAL. I'm surprised he didn't really blame them for the high crime rate in Baltimore while he was at it. But yeah, that's something. I would like to have heard more about how he recovered from the mistake, whether he ever realized he made it, because, we've been reading, or I've been reading anyway. I don't know if we've discussed it on the air. Daniel Dale, who's, I guess, probably the reporter most well-versed in Trump's habits around his lies. I mean, he's a habitual liar all by himself. We understand that. But the little ticks and tips and giveaways, the tells, since we were alliterating, that Trump offers up when he's lying, or certain styles of lie that he has. Daniel Dale's been brilliant in tagging the sir stories. The sir count in a story is indicative of, the appearance of the word sir at all in any of his stories is indicative of it being a lie, and that's largely because everything he says is a lie, so it doesn't matter whether he says sir or not. But one of the things he spotted in the last couple of days, as I recall from his tweets, is that Trump doesn't correct his speech if he very clearly misspeaks. There's just no other way of interpreting what he's saying other than as having misspoken. He, rather than stopping and saying, oh, I mean, or rather, I meant to say, or excuse me, something, he simply adds on to it. So if he, I should find those things. I wonder if I put any of those aside. I like to do justice to them by being exact quotes, but I might not have parked this one anywhere. But his new thing is, if he says, for instance, like for this, I imagine if he had operated the same way, he would have said, the people I blame for the war, I guess in his voice, the people I blame for the war in Yugoslavia, the war in Yugoslavia was terrible, horrible, devastating war in Yugoslavia. And no one is more to blame for what happened in Yugoslavia than the Baltics, the states of the Baltics, the Baltic states. There's only one Baltic, so the states of the Baltic, and also them, but also the Balkans as well. He just adds on as though you are meant to understand. No, I know that the war in Yugoslavia was the fault of the Balkan states, but did you know? Very few people know that the Baltic states also played a tremendous role in the war in Yugoslavia. And it's horrible. It's horrible. Many people have forgotten that. But yes, it's mostly the Balkans, but also the Baltics. And so I'm wondering whether he, tried to employ that tactic or not. I'm very curious. I'd love to know because it's so funny. All right. Let's see. Other things to catch up on, other things we might want to add to the roundup here. There's some Trump-Russia news that we haven't gotten to yet, and some of which happened, I guess, developed last week. We would have heard about these things by now, but I never put them on the record, but I guess we'll make some official mention of the fact that the Wall Street Journal, I guess, was the first one out with the reporting on this, but because I don't subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, that one I can't read. But there are 2, 3, 4, 15 other sources that I put aside noting the same issue that I guess a big story last week was that new information had been developed showing that Donald Trump himself had been central to the directing of decisions on how to pay hush money to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, despite all of his earlier denials. So maybe our best bet for beginning on this would be Mark Sumner's write-up of it from Friday over at Daily Kos. Donald Trump, quote, played a central role in payoffs to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. And he had access, I guess, to the Wall Street Journal, so he helps us out with this one. Wall Street Journal did report on Friday anyway, that Donald Trump was directly involved in payments to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal that violated campaign regulations. Oh my word, they finally have on that one. The Wall Street Journal found that Mr. Trump was involved in or briefed on nearly every step of the agreements. He directed deals in phone calls, of course, and meetings with his self-described fixer, Mr. Cohen, Michael Cohen, that is, who's in town these days talking to the FBI one more time, or Mueller's investigators anyway. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan has gathered evidence of Mr. Trump's participation in transactions. The Journal notes that this is counter, to a 2-year pattern of denials by Mr. Trump, his legal team, and his advisors. Evidence of Trump's involvement was turned up by federal prosecutors in Manhattan pursuing the case against Michael Cohen. Cohen initially denied that Trump had any involvement in paying hush money to either Daniels or McDougal. Federal prosecutors in Manhattan, we're told, I guess probably through the Wall Street Journal here, federal prosecutors in Manhattan came to believe otherwise. In August, they outlined Mr. Trump's role without specifically naming him in a roughly 80-page draft federal indictment they had been preparing to file against Mr. Cohen. When Cohen reached his plea deal later in August, part of that agreement said that Cohen, quote, coordinated with one or more members of the campaign, including through meetings and phone calls, about the fact, nature, and timing of the payments. One of those one or more in the campaign, but here's the problem, it was Trump. Prosecutors had apparently collected the information to demonstrate this before Cohen became a cooperating witness. It's not clear that the revelations will lead to an indictment of Trump for breaking elections rules, even if the Southern District of New York prosecutors believe they are allowed to issue such an indictment. That's because Trump can always try the same path of earlier politicians. He can claim he wasn't trying to hide the payments from the FEC. He was trying to hide them from Melania. The Wall Street Journal article details Trump's actions in handling the payments, particularly in how he communicated not just with Cohen, but with National Enquirer publisher David Pecker to entice McDougal with an offer to publish her story and then get her to sign a contract that allowed the story to be buried instead. The publication then details Trump's actions regarding Stormy Daniels and the company that Cohen set up to pay off both Daniels and pass money through Pecker to McDougal. And for some reason, he decided to do it with all the same company, and that was part of the undoing. Trump's involvement is everywhere, making calls, suggesting how the women should be handled, arranging payments. It was already clear that his claims to not be aware of the payments was a lie, but the Wall Street Journal shows just how large those lies really were. And quoting from them again, Mr. Pecker visited Trump Tower twice during the presidential transition. When he raised Mr. Cohen's request for reimbursement during a meeting in the first week of December 2016, Mr. Trump demurred, saying Mr. Cohen had plenty of money. During Mr. Pecker's second visit, in January 2017, Mr. Trump thanked him for suppressing the McDougal story. Hey, thanks for doing that. And I love how Cohen steps in and finally pays off Daniels because he can't get Trump to do it himself, or at least in a way that they think will work out in helping, in terms of helping them avoid detection. So he takes care of it, and he goes back to the boss and says, well, you're the one that had sex with her. You should be paying the hush money. And you got plenty of money. You do it. Because he's such a generous individual. The potential charges related to Trump's payoffs include charges that he violated campaign finance law, charges to which Michael Cohen has already pleaded guilty. And again, quoting from the papers here, although this time the Washington Post, standing before Judge William H. Pauley III, Cohen admitted guilt on 2 criminal counts, willfully causing an unlawful corporate contribution and making an excessive campaign contribution. The first count dealt with Cohen's negotiation of an agreement with an unnamed company. The context of the government's delineation of charges makes clear that it's American Media Incorporated, publisher of the National Enquirer, to pay former Playboy model Karen McDougal $150,000. That payment was aimed at preventing her from being able to share her story of a year-long affair with Trump with any other media outlet. And now Mark brings us back. In 2008, when John Edwards was charged with making payoffs to conceal an affair, he faced similar charges. He argued that he wasn't really trying to break campaign laws, but trying to keep the information away from his wife. That argument led to a deadlocked jury, but it didn't keep Edwards from being indicted. And since Cohen has already pleaded on these charges, it would seem infinitely harder for Trump to argue that he didn't know he was in violation of campaign laws, especially with Cohen cooperating. So how do you like that? We hadn't gotten to that one. You would have heard this by now, I'm sure, but it was important, I think, to enter onto the record and to get the mechanics of it laid out on the record for us. Okay. And another Mark Sumner piece here from Daily Kos. This one also from Friday. Overlooked so far, at least on the show, in our recapping of all the various problems with Matt Whitaker purportedly serving as acting Attorney General. There is this story. Acting AG Whitaker, and again here, even Mark Sumner makes this mistake and calls him the acting AG, wrecked the career of Iowa's first openly gay senator with false charges. That will only, of course, make him a favorite in the Trump White House. But here's the story. Matthew Whitaker's unconstitutional gig as acting Attorney General isn't his first go-round at Republican, quote, justice. After Whitaker's first failed political campaign, and you'll recall, I think he sought the Republican nomination for Senate in Iowa back in, I think, 2014. But he had been involved in politics before that. I'm sorry. And we're talking about his earlier career in the state legislature, I guess. Is that where he was positioned? Why don't I just read the story, and we'll find out that way. After Whitaker's first failed political campaign, George W. Bush gifted him with Republican welfare in the form of an appointment to a U.S. Attorney's office for the Southern District of Iowa. Okay, going way back. There we are. All right, now we've got the story correct. Whitaker then used that office in a blatantly political attempt to take down the state's first openly gay senator with a bribery case that, quote, fell apart when he tried to take it to court. As reported by the Associated Press, Whitaker used his position to generate politically motivated charges against State Senator Matt McCoy. And it is quoted here, I guess, from the Associated Press, that he is a rising star in the Democratic Party, Iowa's first openly gay senator, and a leading champion for the party's causes, unquote. Well, in 2007, Whitaker held a press conference to declare that a grand jury had charged McCoy with attempted extortion, bringing a potential penalty of 20 years in prison. But the case that McCoy had given the grand jury was based on a trap that Whitaker spent months building, in which he wired up a paid informant in an attempt to press money on McCoy. The problem was that Whitaker's informant had an actual business arrangement with a company owned by McCoy, and the bribes he recorded were actually payments to that company. At trial, McCoy's attorneys charged prosecutorial misconduct, pointing out that the videos Whitaker showed jurors had been edited to leave out the business relationship and to exclude the senator turning down a personal payment. Whitaker also left out the fact that the person putting checks in front of McCoy had been paid repeatedly by the FBI, and it wasn't just the jury Whitaker failed to inform that the whole thing had been a paid setup. He also didn't inform McCoy's defense attorneys. But the information came out before trial, and when the jurors heard the truth, it didn't take them long to reach a decision. Whitaker spent 9 days trying to make his case. The jurors were back in less than 2 hours, including a long lunch break. McCoy was vindicated, and the Des Moines Register had a comment that seems oddly familiar in describing Whitaker's motivations. Quote, "It has all the earmarks of a politically motivated witch hunt," unquote. That is familiar sounding, don't you think? After the trial, McCoy's supporters cheered his victory, but the lengthy legal action by Whitaker left the senator and businessman broke and discouraged. McCoy said that he continues to suffer from the reputational damage and is still paying off the $100,000 in legal fees that he incurred fighting the charge. When he was considering a run for Congress last year in a seat a Democrat captured in Tuesday's election, a national publication brought his indictment back up in what he called a damaging story. Matthew Whitaker may not have gotten a victory in court, and he may have barely skated away from charges of prosecutorial misconduct after admitting, quote, mistakes, but he clearly got the results he wanted, sidelining a rising star of the Democratic Party and damaging an openly gay politician both personally and financially. During his time, as U.S. Attorney, Whitaker was a keynote speaker for an anti-gay rights group. He also declared that opposition to gay marriage was one of his, quote, no negotiation positions. What a special fellow he is. All right, well worth taking the time to learn about that incident and to get it straight. Thank you very much, Mark, for setting us straight on how that happened and which position he was abusing at the time. Let's see. Other interesting notes from the election fallout. This one not particularly weighty, I guess, in all this, but perhaps you would be pleased to hear this one. A ProPublica reporter, Jessica Huseman, Huseman, reporting this one. Chris Kobach, apparently, in looking back on his surprise to him loss in the Kansas governor's race, he didn't fundraise or call volunteers or even have working phones in one of his offices. But he was so confident he was going to win that he actually did make time to do a walkthrough of the governor's office, like what kind of curtains are. He's basically literally saying, measuring the place for curtains. And, called out on that one and ended up losing the election outright. This one reported by a couple of ProPublica reporters here and printed in Kansas City Star. We haven't time to read it, certainly before the break. And I don't know how revealing the thing is of any juicy details from which we might extract just a little bit more laughter in the face of Chris Kobach, but that might not necessarily be the best use of our time. We'll have to take a look over the break and decide on that. A few other items up for inclusion in today's show during our last segment after this 2-minute break, during which we can catch our breath, get a sip of water, reset for the end of the show. These Tuesdays are tough ones, I gotta tell you. All right. So like I said, we'll be back in 2 minutes, just catching the auto-playing video here of the concession speech. Fun to watch. Maybe we'll share a little bit more of that Kobach story after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. What direction will we go next? Let's do some Trump Russia here. If we can get rid of the various pop-up ads in our way, it will be a lot easier. Thanks very much, The Hill. The more recent, I think, of the two should perhaps come first, unless we... Let's see, which one... All right, yeah, let's go back. We'll do them in chronological order, I guess, the chronological order of their reporting. The Hill's piece here, where did this one originate? Let's see. I guess it must be from Le Monde. So interesting. I'm not going to be able to read you the original on that one. Russian oligarch who bought mansion from Trump, detained and questioned on corruption charges, according to this report. This one, again, in the Hill, John Bowden covering the story. I think I mentioned it in the closing minutes of one of the shows last week. We'll catch up with this one. A Russian billionaire. You may recognize the story when we get around to where the arrest was made. A Russian billionaire who purchased a mansion from President Trump in 2008 in a business deal that is now being investigated by special counsel Robert Mueller was detained Tuesday in Monaco. Remember when we mentioned this happened in Monaco, and questioned related to an ongoing corruption probe. And I assume that we'll get a description of the actual transaction between him and Trump later on in this piece. But that one will ring a bell with you if you don't already know which one we're talking about when we get down there. Dmitry Rybolovlev. Remember when we had to try and pronounce that name? It's Rybolovlev. I guess I didn't realize it was another L in there. Rybolovlev. Dmitry Rybolovlev, president of AS Monaco, which I guess is a subsidiary of his other worldwide operation. AS Monaco. He was detained voluntarily by authorities in Monaco on Tuesday and is under investigation for charges of corruption and influence peddling, according to French news service Le Monde. Are they a news service and not a newspaper? Okay. And I guess the headline has it more correct here. They said detained and questioned. I said arrested, and it seems clear that that was not the case. He was voluntarily detained and questioned in Monaco. Everything's voluntary in Monaco. I don't know. In a statement, Rybolovlev's lawyers, oh my, I'm going to have to deal with, are they Monacan lawyers? I don't know how you, Hervé Temime, T-E-M-I-M-E, or Temime. Everybody hates the Temimes. They're always trying to get out of those invisible boxes. And Thomas Giacardi, that's not hard to pronounce, I don't think, asked that his presumption of innocence be respected amid the questioning. And you know how those Monacans are, or we should call them monocles. I think that's a better name for them. We regret the breach of confidentiality of the judicial process that this information represents. You aren't even meant to know. And maybe that's why he allowed himself to be detained voluntarily. Had he forced them to arrest him, it would have been made public for sure. But those leaky monocles told us that he got detained and questioned. Well, the lawyers regret the breach of confidentiality, yada, yada. Furthermore, they added, the information that has formed the basis of the case was seized from the mobile phone of Mr. Rybolovlev's lawyer, and it's an action which itself remains the subject of a pending case in the Monaco Court of Cassation. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that one correct. Cassation. Who knows what that is in the Monacanolian court system? Monaco Court of Cassation. I'll look that one up off the air. Maybe you will too. We're curious kinds of people. Rybolovlev, though, was the purchaser of a Florida mansion. This is a terrible construction. Rybolovlev was the purchaser of a Florida mansion from Trump in 2008 for $95 million. Rybolovlev bought a mansion from Trump in 2008. That was the $95 million purchase of the thing. He had bought relatively soon before then for something like $41 million he paid for it. And it was a teardown. And I think that's on property next door to or very close to Mar-a-Lago. But, a mansion that he never lived in. And he overpaid for it when he bought it, but then he doubled the price he had paid for it within a couple of years. Very fishy. Everybody remembers that one. Again, a sharp increase from the $41 million Trump had paid for the property just 4 years earlier. Never living in the mansion, Rybolovlev instead divided the property into 3 parcels, 2 of which he has sold so far for a combined $71 million, according to the New York Times. Now, so was he a real estate genius, even more genius than Donald Trump, seeing that even paying $95 million for the parcel would be a good investment? 2 of the 3 parcels have already been sold for $71 million, so he's just got another $24 million to go to make his money back on one of the parcels, and the other 2 sold for, I guess, on average anyway, $35.5 million. His purchase of the mansion is one of several Trump business transactions that Bloomberg News reported last year were under investigation by Mueller, who is probing allegations of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government during the 2016 election. I bet you didn't know that. In Monaco, Rybolovlev has been under investigation ever since text messages surfaced revealing that his lawyer was regularly in contact with top law enforcement officials in Monaco, enticing them with event tickets and other perks, according to the Times. No charges have yet been filed. It must be hard to get tickets to the Monaco Grand Prix there in Monaco, and I don't know what kind of events they were getting tickets to. I don't know of any other event in Monaco, but that's not to say that the events were in Monaco. I assume that a lot of events that attract people from Monaco are elsewhere. Very small Monaco is. Philippe Narmino, Monaco's justice minister, resigned, interestingly enough, last year, we don't know when, over the scandal after it was revealed that he had thanked Rybolovlev through the Russian's attorney for a helicopter trip to Rybolovlev's ski resort. That doesn't sound good. Trump and his allies have attacked the special counsel for investigating the president's business ties, which they've argued are outside the scope of Mueller's mandate, under the Justice Department. They just figured they'd throw that little note in there for us, and okay, terrific. Now we know. Now there's another Russia story floating around. I'd be curious to see if it is connected or involves some of the same people. And it doesn't, but the same rotating cast of characters. Anyway, this from Vice News. Alleged spy took a Russian oligarch's jet for a secret 2016 meeting with Paul Manafort, who is, of course, in prison right now. Greg Walters wrote this for Vice News. Let's take a look. Soon after joining Donald Trump's presidential campaign in March 2016, and remember, he was only there for a very short time, Paul Manafort began trading emails with his right-hand man from Ukraine, Konstantin Kilimnik, remember him, about their billionaire former business partner, Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska. Their relationship with the tycoon had soured. You remember this story. Deripaska had filed complaints against Manafort in court for millions allegedly owed to him, and Manafort was looking for ways to smooth things over. How do we use to get whole? Manafort asked Kilimnik in an April email, noting the press coverage surrounding his new role on the Trump campaign. How can we use my new position on the Trump campaign to somehow make things right with Oleg Deripaska such that he doesn't come after us looking for cash? In July, Manafort followed up on his cryptic question by telling Kilimnik to offer private briefings to Deripaska, one of Russian President Vladimir Putin's closest billionaire allies, according to emails disclosed by the Washington Post. In August, Manafort and Kilimnik finally met face-to-face in a ritzy cigar lounge 4 blocks from Trump Tower. Which ritzy cigar lounge? Is that the one? I mean, is that the one that's in 666 Fifth Avenue? The Kushner's building? Don't they have a fancy cigar bar in there, too? I thought we might have read that in the past. Now, congressional investigators and the lineup of, or at least the balance of power as among the congressional investigators, soon set to change. Don't forget that. Congressional investigators believe Kilimnik used Deripaska's private Gulfstream 550 jet for at least one leg of that journey. A person familiar with their findings told Vice News, confirming a report in The Guardian on Friday. All right, so let me make sure I got this. Manafort and Kilimnik. Now, they're partners. When they say finally met face-to-face, I mean, I guess they've met face-to-face before, because aren't they? They're business partners. I mean, they could have done all their work remotely, but maybe they finally had this meeting that they were talking about having in order to figure out, could they use Manafort's position in the Trump campaign to placate Deripaska. So they met in August at the cigar place 4 blocks from Trump Tower. Kilimnik, who's in Ukraine, right, flies to New York on Deripaska's jet. All right, so that's where we are. Whether Kilimnik was a passenger on Deripaska's jet for both directions of its round trip between Moscow and Newark in early August 2016 remains unclear, the person said. There's some discrepancy in the travel log about one half of the journey, the person told Vice News. Deripaska has repeatedly denied, quote, any interactions during, after, or in the run-up to the 2016 presidential elections with Manafort, including any briefings. But congressional investigators' assertions that Kilimnik used the oligarch's plane for that August 2016 meeting raises fresh questions about the nature of Manafort's relationship with Deripaska in the lead-up to the election. Federal investigators have been poring over the details of that key period for at least 2 years, and I believe they used the wrong spelling of pouring there. Anyway, Russian contact, our next section here. In April, Special Counsel Robert Mueller reportedly sent a list of 4 questions to Trump's lawyers, including an inquiry about Manafort. What knowledge do you have of any outreach by your campaign, including by Paul Manafort, to Russia about potential assistance to the campaign? Kilimnik's links to the Trump campaign have likewise been carefully scrutinized. FBI agents believe Kilimnik had ties to a Russian intelligence service in 2016, Mueller's team wrote in a court filing earlier this year. Kilimnik, who is reportedly now living in the Moscow suburb of Khimki, Khimki, has strenuously denied being a Russian spy. He didn't return an email requesting comment from Vice News for this story. The use of Deripaska's jet would suggest that one of Putin's top oligarch allies knew about both the meeting and the substance of Kilimnik's discussion with Manafort, says Mary McCord, who led the Justice Department's investigation into foreign meddling in the 2016 election before stepping down in early 2017. If Kilimnik flew to New York on Deripaska's private jet for a meeting with Manafort, That would be of great interest to the special counsel, McCord told Vice News, and it certainly suggests that when Kilimnik returned to Moscow, he would have debriefed with the person on whose jet he had just flown. A spokesperson for Deripaska declined to comment on Kilimnik or the August flights in an email Monday and blasted the media for tabloid-style coverage. It is regrettable, you might even say, to see how unethical some media outlets have become in their effort to spread unverified, partisan, and ill-intended nonsense in a tabloid-style manner, wrote the spokesperson, who asked not to be named. Most importantly, this has nothing to do with quality journalism, and we simply will not engage with any spurious requests. I see. In March, Vice News first revealed that the jet's flight from Moscow to Newark, New Jersey, several miles outside Manhattan, had captured investigators' attention. At that time, a spokesperson for Deripaska said that the plane was simply carrying members of the Russian billionaire's family. The passengers of the flights during the time period in early August 2016 were Mr. Deripaska's family only. The spokesperson, who likewise asked not to be named, wrote in an email to Vice News earlier this year. Thus, we repeat that any publications implying that Mr. Deripaska directly or indirectly communicated with Mr. Manafort in 2016 would be a false statement of fact. But the oligarch's murky ties to Trump's former campaign chairman have continued to be of interest to federal investigators. In September 2016, 1 month after Kilimnik met with Manafort, FBI agents appeared at a home Deripaska maintained in New York and pressed him about whether Manafort, quote, had served as a link between the campaign and the Kremlin. According to the New York Times, Deripaska rebuked the FBI's inquiries, calling their questions about his role in the campaign preposterous. The Times reported he again denied any connections to Manafort during the election season or that Kilimnik flew on his jet he denied that to The Guardian on Friday. We vigorously deny all these allegations and false information, which has no ground and is being plotted by someone who for more than a year has been unsuccessfully trying to develop a story which does not exist, a spokesperson for Mr. Deripaska told the British newspaper. In April, Deripaska and other Russian oligarchs were hit with sanctions, which the U.S. Treasury Department said were aimed at punishing Russia for its aggressive foreign policy, including attempts to, quote, subvert Western democracies. Deripaska has responded with a lobbying campaign to have the sanctions on him and his companies lifted, according to a detailed Times report early in November. Mueller's prosecutors pursued Manafort vigorously over a bevy of criminal charges, mostly unrelated to the 2016 campaign, until he finally pled guilty in September, striking a sweeping agreement with the feds that he disclose everything he knows. During his trial in Alexandria, Virginia, prosecutors painted Manafort as a brilliant political strategist driven by greed who'd successfully parlayed his role on campaigns into tens of millions of dollars. They cast Kilimnik as one of Manafort's closest lieutenants. Kilimnik played a role in Manafort's Ukrainian exploits as Manafort's translator and general local fixer, sitting in on important meetings. The two men forged a tight relationship while working for the country's Russia-friendly former president, Viktor Yanukovych. People who know both men, Yanukovych and who are we talking about? Kilimnik? People who know them both told Vice News, I guess, that Kilimnik played this key role in Manafort's Ukrainian exploits. He, Kilimnik, got into a really close father and son relationship with Paul Manafort, a person who's known both men for years, told Vice. At Manafort's trial, prosecutors said Kilimnik had signatory authority over several of his boss's hidden offshore bank accounts during those years. How do you like that? Their work in Ukraine together proved fabulously lucrative while it lasted. Manafort raked in some $65 million advising Yanukovych between 2010 and 2014 after masterminding Yanukovych's shocking presidential electoral win, according to evidence presented at his trial. But when Ukraine's government collapsed in chaos and Yanukovych fled to Moscow in 2014, Manafort needed new revenue streams to maintain his lavish lifestyle, prosecutors said. In September, he pled guilty to submitting fraudulent applications for multi-million-dollar bank loans during the following years. Regardless, Manafort offered up his services to the Trump campaign free of charge in February of 2016. Not really in a position to do that. Even though he didn't draw a paycheck from Trump, prosecutors said Manafort found a way to make his political activities work for his wallet. He arranged to take about $16 million in loans out from a small Chicago lender called the Federal Savings Bank, while pushing to get that bank's majority owner and CEO, Stephen Koch, appointed as Trump's Secretary of the Army. Prosecutor said, okay, very insider game there. His lingering business disputes with Deripaska, however, remained unsolved. As the 2016 campaign got underway, Kilimnik assured Manafort that he had forwarded articles about Manafort's new role in the Trump campaign to a Deripaska aide, The Atlantic reported. Kilimnik wrote, "I am more than sure that it will be resolved and we will get back to the original relationship. It hasn't worked out that way. Companies controlled by Deripaska would eventually pursue Manafort for millions in courts in the Cayman Islands, Virginia, and New York. In January of this year, a company controlled by Deripaska sued Manafort and Gates in New York for at least $25 million in damages connected to a failed joint cable and internet venture in Ukraine, according to court documents." Wow. All right. So an interesting twist at the end there, too. Well, nothing definitive just yet, but lots of names swirling, and I feel like it's a day that we're going to have to pay attention to those names and call back to some of them, because all indications on the morning chatter on Twitter is about, people drawing clues from all sources that they can in an attempt to, I guess, weave together a narrative that has it that Mueller will be acting on subpoenas very quickly, possibly today or at least this week. Whether or not, any of this holds any real weight with Mueller, I don't know. But a lot of people are pointing to the relative silence. I think they keep pointing to the Fox News Twitter accounts being relatively silent over the past couple of days, though I haven't noticed any real change in the way the president is tweeting. So I'm not entirely sure I buy into the scenario they're outlining. But it does feel like it will be time to call back to some of those major players, particularly those connected to Manafort, who's already convicted in this case. All right. Let's see. I want to catch up with a couple other notes that we've gotten along the way. Michael Musson commenting much earlier in the show about the Homeland Security situation, the Homeland Security chief getting fired. I know a Trump Tower doorman. That's always very flattering to Trump. Okay, we'll take that into consideration. Rebecca Romans noting here, grifters gotta grift. Here's a tweet noting that after losing her job, Kim Davis down in Kentucky is becoming an evangelical preacher. What do you know? Well, a notorious avocation for those who are grifters, but maybe that'll keep her down in Kentucky and away from the rest of us. Matthew Rigdon noting, I'm torn. Do I want to laugh at Chris Kobach or just forget him entirely? Well, it's up to you. But if you are interested, I do recommend taking a good look at the Kansas City Star / ProPublica piece. Is it a / ProPublica piece, or is it just being shared by ProPublica reporter who was pointing to, that doesn't say that. All right, well, good reporting nonetheless from the Kansas City Star, no matter where the reporters are basing themselves and doing the work. And it is funny. And I took a look at the first couple paragraphs there. We're not going to have time to get through it today, but you might enjoy watching how Kobach, whatever, allowed his campaign to fall apart probably through sheer hubris. I guess he figured there's just no losing for a conservative Republican like me here in Kansas, and decided just to not do the work, essentially. So I recommend taking a look at that one, and of course we'll include it in our roundup that Scott Anderson will help put together later on today. And thanks as always to Scott. I don't say it enough, Scott, how valuable it is that you are able to put these things together, freeing me up to do things like breathe and catch up with the oxygen deficit that I sometimes suffer at the end of a show like this one today. Okay. Let's see. We've got all the, I'm sure there's more Trump-Russia stories out there, but the ones that I thought that were important to put out there and refresh our memories of the names for today, I think are all out on the line here. Let's see. Other things that probably deserve a share before we wrap things up for the day. Let's see. A short note from Josh Dorner the other day, just LOLing and sharing with the rest of us the fact that the NRCC, the National Republican Campaign Committee, the Congressional Campaign Committee, equivalent of the DCCC, spent $5 million on the doomed Comstock campaign. Comstock, of course, lost by 12 points out here in Virginia 10th District. That's more money than what the NRCC spent on all the California Republicans in tough races combined. How do you like that? And that laughter prompted by, whose piece is this? Huffington Post piece. Amanda Turkle sharing this one and commenting that it is a great behind-the-scenes piece of why the Dems took back the House and some of the big missteps of Republicans in so doing. How Democrats and Republicans made 2018 a blue wave when it almost when it almost wasn't. Yes, it was a wave, by Matt Fuller and Kevin Robillard. So another fun and inspiring look at that. I would say that would probably make a good companion piece to the Kansas City Star bit about the hubris that caused Republicans to worsen the wave for themselves. I think there's a lot to that. All right, let's see. Since we spoke about the Wall Street Journal report earlier in the show, here's a comment about it, I think, yes, by Walter Schaub, who you all remember as the former director of the Office of Government Ethics and an impressive Twitter presence these days. He, tweeting about that story, says, an important aspect of the excellent new investigative piece by the Wall Street Journal is about to be overlooked, and we'll find out when I remind myself what that thing is, whether it eventually was overlooked or we all know it already. This part right here establishes that Trump committed a felony when he knowingly omitted his debt to Michael Cohen from his June 2017 financial disclosure report. Very interesting. And a screen grab here from the Wall Street Journal piece that says, later that month, after Mr. Trump's election win, Mr. Cohen met with Mr. Weisselberg, remember him, to discuss reimbursement for the payment to Ms. Clifford. And this is what Mr. Cohen has told prosecutors. So he says outright, yeah, I met with Weisselberg and trying to prevail on Trump to pay me back for the payment to Ms. Clifford. That's the woman we know as Stormy Daniels. So very interesting, having excluded or failed to declare his debt to Michael Cohen on his June 2017 financial disclosure report, Trump gets himself in trouble with federal law on yet another aspect of this entire mess. Okay, well, that is it for today, and we'll play ourselves out with the familiar music, and I do believe I've got the right music running this time. Let's see. Lots more, of course, to catch up with over the balance of the week. Tomorrow, being Wednesday, we'll have both Greg Dworkin and Joan McCarter with us, and we can discuss still more of the fallout from the elections, what's coming up, what to expect, if anything, from the lame duck session. And I do have some indication from the Hill here, a piece entitled Congress Braces for High Drama Lame Duck. So we'll discuss that, catch up with Joan, and see what she sees coming on the horizon. It's hard to really believe that they'll be able to get anything done during this lame duck, but you never know, especially if they're willing to bend, break, or demolish the rules along the way. I now am relying struggling with my aging and slowing laptop to get to my Skype message from Justice Putnam so that I can tell you what's coming up next on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. And if I can just scroll down, here we go. Starting off on his Bistro Cafe side, the Matt Whitaker appointment as acting AG, which is fake, is certainly a disaster, but it's perfectly okay to say bye, Felicia, to the end of Jeff Sessions' tenure at the, quote, Justice Department. Also coming up, Trump blew off Veterans Day while his campaign hawked vet-themed swag. Jerome Corsi, yes, forgot about him, says he's just a swift boat trip up the river from prison.
From Daily Kos
Hooray.
Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Yeah, Jerome Corsi says yesterday he is expecting to be indicted on perjury and perhaps looking at spending the rest of his life in jail, which is okay with me. I don't care where he dies, I suppose. The GOP's reaction to the 2018 midterms is an attempted power grab by a would-be authoritarian movement. We'll find out what that's all about next.